Next, we have a special live session. First, we'll be joined by Senator Christine Rolfes, Washington State Senator in the 23rd Legislative District. After her presentation and the subsequent presentation from Representative Derek Kilmer, they'll be available for questions and answers, so stick around. Welcome, Senator Rolfes.
Are we officially beginning our portion? Here we go. Thank you. I want to thank Commissioner Kreidler for hosting this conversation today. It's really important. We know the people of Washington State have climate change and climate policy as a priority. I'm hoping the rest of the country will soon catch up to us, and surely the insurance industry should also be watching. So this is a really important conversation for all of us to be having together. I was asked to talk specifically about what Washington State has been doing related to climate policy and climate resilience. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to just run through some slides that I think will help illustrate the work that we've been doing in this great state. I am a state senator. We have 49 state senators and 98 state representatives, so 147 people in the legislature. Every time we get together in January, it is our job to make decisions that a majority of us can live with and can agree on. So when I say that we are making progress in the state of Washington, it means that a majority of the people who represent the people of the state are interested in and willing to make complicated decisions that will help future generations. So the first slide that I would like to begin with is just a strong statement that our current governor, Jay Inslee, is a strong proponent, just a strong advocate for policies related to fighting climate change. But the commitment in our state has existed since before Governor Inslee's time. In 2007, Governor Christine Gregoire led the legislature in discussions about climate policy, what we needed to do as a state to fight climate change, and how we needed to become more resilient. And so we adopted goals back in 2007. We adopted climate goals, pollution goals over the next 50 years that would help guide our path towards reducing pollution and minimizing our state's impact on climate change. We also formed a collaborative with Western states, 5 or 6 states of Mexico, and 3 Canadian provinces to share science and to share policy ideas. And then in our state, you folks who have been watching or participating in this conference over the last several hours already heard from Dr. Snover from the University of Washington, but the Climate Impacts Group is sort of our CDC and Dr. Fauci of coronavirus fame. We look at the UW's Climate Impact Group for science and for guidance and how we set our policies. So we've been doing this now in our state actively for 13 years. Next slide. And even with our dedication, even with the work that we've done, we have a lot of work to do. So in 2007, we set goals. The easiest goal to understand is that by 2020, so that's today, our emissions would be equal to what they were in 1990. That would require a lot of work and a lot of policy change. And we started making those changes. We started changing those laws. But if you take a look at this graphic, you can see historic emission levels in Washington State starting with 1990. And they pretty much flatlined. On the top line, the green line shows business as usual. In 2019, we asked the Department of Ecology, how are we doing? They said, if you don't make any changes, this is what it's going to look like. And it's about 8% above 1990. So even with all the work that we did, we didn't hit our first goal. So in 2019, the governor gave us a package of bills and said, and with the implication that if we could pass policies like this, we could hit the state's targets. The state's targets are illustrated in the orange block, the orange box there. If we were gonna adopt all of this, we could hit the orange block. So we started. We passed a number of bills in 2019, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a couple of minutes. But we also said, you know what, this is doable. And so just this year, we essentially adopted the same goals as the Paris Accord for our state. And so let's move forward. Let's be a meaningful participant in this global discussion, and let's do our part. And so if we were going to do that, we would need to be moving from the blue line to the maroon line. So that's a lot more work for us to do. The next slide. So why does that matter? Why should we be doing this in Washington State? Why does one state matter? And why is it so hard? So our state, since the Governor Gregoire first put her goals out, has grown by 1 million people since 2007. We've added 1 million Washingtonians. We're currently at 7.6 million people, almost 8 million, and we're growing at a rate of almost 100,000 people a year. And that's not Washingtonians having babies. 76% of that growth is people moving here because we're a fantastic place to live. We have beautiful landscapes, great outdoor recreation, and a lot of really good paying jobs. And we have these good paying jobs in sectors like technology and in energy because we are a leader in innovation and our innovative companies work here and have set up shop here. So our state is growing. Our economy is the 14th largest in the country. And if Washington were a country, we would be the 30th largest economy in the world. So what we do does matter. Doesn't matter as much as India, but it matters as much as Norway. And we're approaching this like we are a global leader. And we believe that if we approach climate policy and climate change and innovation like a world leader, our state will continue to lead and will continue to grow. So our next slide begins the conversation about what kinds of policies, what kinds of regulations we've been changing. Last year, as part of the governor's climate package, we adopted one of the nation's leading renewable energy, clean energy bills. So our state will be completely phasing out the use of coal power by 2025. By 2030, we are expecting all of our electricity, all of our energy to be carbon neutral. And by 2045, we will be only using 100% renewable energy in this state. And that for us is doable. And that's primarily because we rely heavily on hydroelectricity, which is carbon free. And so we have a great advantage compared to other states. We also, in 2011, took a really bold step in working with the community of Centralia to shut down the state's only coal-fired power plant. And so that will be completely shut down by 2025. I believe they're transitioning to natural gas, but regardless, the state will not be producing any more coal. The trick for us is that last 5%, getting the last 5% of our energy to be clean. And that's where the utilities are really going to have a lot of work to do. The next slide. Because our state is primarily hydroelectric power, our biggest polluting sector is transportation. And so we've been making progress over the years, but transportation really is still the biggest single polluter remaining. It's kind of our last frontier. So last year, we approved legislation that brings us into the zero emission vehicle category. So we're aligned with California and 9 or 10 other states, requiring manufacturers to sell all their products here, all their electric cars here. We also have invested heavily in private and public fast charging stations to make it more desirable for people to have electric cars. And our ferry system, which crisscrosses Puget Sound, is one of the biggest polluters in the state in terms of transportation emissions. And so we have begun making investments in converting the ferry engines to hybrid electric and all battery powered. And so we'll be making some good gains there over the next 10 years. And then we're also looking at clean high-speed rail between Vancouver, British Columbia and Portland. So that's where we're going with transportation. The next slide talks about agriculture. And this is a new sector for the state to be exploring, and it's kind of a new frontier in carbon policy. But in the last couple of years, we've passed a number of bills related to reducing food waste, and that includes the waste of food as it's coming off the farm and being sent to storage, and as well as the waste that you produce in your home when you let food rot in the refrigerator. So we have a comprehensive system of food waste reduction that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of years. And then also carbon sequestration in soils, and how can we use new kinds of agricultural production that not only store carbon, but use less fossil fuel in the production, whether it's in fertilizers or the gas that tractors use. So that the agricultural sector is one place that we are starting to take a look. And then finally, the last of our major greenhouse gas climate related bills is the next slide. And it is a phase out of hydrofluorocarbons, mimicking legislation that was passed in California over the last couple of years. Once we do this, we are regulating the emissions from 8 different kinds of pollutants. So nothing that's in your home right now or in your business will need to be retrofitted, but new products being manufactured, new equipment being manufactured and sold in the state will need to comply with our new hydrofluorocarbon laws. And the reduction of those 8 chemicals combined is the equivalent of taking 1 million cars off the road. So it will be significant reduction in emissions over time. The next slide is where we start to look at climate resilience. So we know from the science from the University of Washington that our best case scenario is a 1.5 Celsius centigrade increase in temperature over the next 30, 50 years. That's our best bet. With that small of an increase, we see dramatically hotter summers, more drought, snowpack melts, warmer streams, which is bad for salmon, and ocean acidification. So one of the things our state has been preparing for is catastrophic wildfires. And we've made significant advancements and investments in forest health and fire suppression over the last few years to start to combat not just the loss in timber and the loss of carbon and the loss of habitat, but to start to combat just the complete waste. We lose our carbon storage, and we're hurting people and damaging property when we're not taking care of this. So the wildfire issue is climate resilience as well as carbon storage. We're killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. We also, next slide, have been focusing on floods, reducing flood damage, and rebuilding flood plains. The Chehalis River Basin is probably the easiest example for folks from Washington to understand. We have put a lot of money into reducing the potential for flood damage in that river basin. And we have been rebuilding natural drainages of floodplains to reduce flooding throughout a lot of Western Washington, because we know that with climate change, we'll have bigger flooding events in the wintertime. And then the last slide, or the second to last slide, is what else are we doing? So we're doing a lot. We're looking at other legislation for the upcoming years. Last year, we also passed some new rules about energy efficient commercial buildings. So Representative Kilmer will be speaking to the group later. He and I partnered in the legislature years ago on new energy efficiency rules for the real estate sector. And we're building on those rules that we put in place about 10 years ago. The Insurance Commissioner's Office is also leading a natural disaster and resiliency work group that makes regular recommendations to the legislature. And we have 2 different advisory groups working on climate change impacts to our coastal areas. One focused on ocean acidification, and the other group is focused on sea level rise. And we will certainly continue conversations related to clean fuels, whether we need a carbon tax or cap and trade system, and other efforts to decarbonize the state. And so the last slide that I have for you is what's next. And I talked a little bit about that. We're all in this together. You know, the economy in our state is ironically still one of the strongest in the country, even in this pandemic economy, even with the recession that we're in right now. We will remain an amazing place to work, an amazing place to set up businesses, an amazing place to live. And we have the political will and the interest in this state to make progress, to lead the country, and to help lead the whole world into a new economy that's less polluting and safe for everybody. So I'm honored actually to have been invited to present our state's perspective on this. And it's really an honor to be part of a legislature that's willing to act in this way. And I'm hoping that we'll have strong partners in our federal government, and looking forward to Congressman Kilmer's report. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rolfes. Next, please welcome Representative Derek Kilmer, who represents Washington's 6th Congressional District.
Okay, I see my face, so that must mean I'm up. Hi, everybody. I'm Derek Kilmer. It says that my internet is unstable, which seems perhaps fitting for a report from our nation's capital. Listen, I think Governor Inslee put it really well when he said we are the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. And I am very grateful to Commissioner Kreidler and to leaders like Christine Rolfes and our state legislature with the energy and the vision that they're showing to combat the climate crisis. Because I think America should be aspirational and should have a sense of urgency about addressing this pressing challenge. But listen, there's no denying it. Climate change is real. And in my view, Congress has a moral obligation to act. This is an issue that doesn't just involve protecting our environment. It's also about protecting our economic interests, our communities, and our national security. In our region, in the district I represent, we have 4 coastal tribes that, as we sit here on this Zoom, are literally in the process of trying to move to higher ground as a result of rising sea levels and more severe storms, not to mention the threat of tsunami. As the climate has warmed and areas become drier, uncontrollable wildfires are raging across our home state. Our shellfish industry and our fisheries are seeing changing ocean chemistry impact the health of our marine life and the industries and livelihoods that depend on it. Even the largest employer in the district I represent, the Department of Defense, identifies climate change as a threat multiplier that makes our world less safe, not to mention the fact that, as you may have noticed, most of our Navy bases are on the water. Unfortunately, though, too many politicians in our nation's capital are catering to special interests and are ignoring scientific consensus on this issue. We need to act, and we need to act now if we're going to make progress in addressing this global threat. I recently had a constituent express dismay that the Trump administration, in her words, hadn't done enough on climate change, that they had, in her words, done nothing. And I don't say this in a partisan way. I just want to tell you what I told her. I said, I only wish that was true, because the reality is, if they'd done nothing, that would have been better than some of the things that they had done that move us in the wrong direction. The president has referred to climate change as a hoax. He withdrew our nation from the Paris Climate Agreement. He repealed the Obama administration's revolutionary Clean Power Plan standards. He has sought to open our coast to new offshore drilling and put our public lands up for sale to the highest bidder. And I think, unfortunately, that has happened despite the findings of a report from the president's own administration, which, along with the recent report from the United Nations, are a call to action to fight the climate crisis. The reality is Congress can't wait for certainly this president to act. And that's why I'm encouraged that this Congress, we've seen some action. We saw a new committee in Congress established called the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that put out a comprehensive plan, really a roadmap to put the country on the path to net zero carbon pollution by 2050 at the latest, but also with critical interim steps to move the needle in the way that science requires. It proposes doing so in a way that would grow the economy and put Americans to work in clean energy jobs. It proposes doing it in a way that ensures communities and farmers can withstand the impacts of climate change. It proposes doing so in a way that protects America's lands and waters for future generations and addresses the legacy of environmental injustice harming America's low-income communities and communities of color. The Select Committee's proposal also included 5 bills that I was proud to introduce, including one focusing on research, one on resiliency, and several focused on protecting our public lands and public waters. In my view, and I really encourage you to visit the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis's website and look at the plan, but I think it presents an extraordinary roadmap for our country to take the vital action that's required. We need to take specific, tangible steps forward to make progress against this existential threat. There is a real opportunity here to make a difference, and that's why I'm glad that the House is taking action. It's not just issuing the report, it's also moving on legislation. I'm an original co-sponsor of a bill called the Climate Action Now Act. When in DC, every bill gets a number, and the majority party is allowed to designate the first 9 bills, HR 1 through 9, for their main priorities. HR 9 is a bill called Climate Action Now that would reaffirm America's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. It would direct the administration to develop and make public a comprehensive plan to meet the significant emission reductions that we as a nation and nearly every other nation committed to back in 2015. I was proud to co-sponsor this bill. I was proud to see it pass the House in May of 2019, and it actually did get some bipartisan support. So that should give us hope that there's an avenue here. On top of that, just 2 weeks ago, the House passed legislation focused on investment in renewable energy. It would require the Department of Energy to fund the research, development, and implementation of projects that help transition to a clean energy economy, including focusing on energy storage and microgrid technologies that use renewable energy sources. On top of that, the bill would establish stricter building codes and energy efficiency requirements. It expands research and development efforts related to wind, solar, advanced geothermal, and other measures to reduce carbon pollution. The bill proposes expanding the use of electric vehicles, including initiating an electric vehicle supply equipment rebate program. Again, you saw the House pass this. I was proud to support it, but importantly, you actually saw some bipartisan support for it. There are other ideas that I think may see traction in the new year. Perhaps most significantly, I'm a sponsor of a bill called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's a bold and it's a bipartisan proposal to put a price on carbon and return the net revenue back to the American people, providing a significant monetary incentive to reduce carbon emissions. I'll point out that just last month, the Business Roundtable, comprised of some of the largest businesses in our nation, embraced the notion of putting a price on carbon. On top of that, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill called the 100% Clean Energy Economy Act, which would establish a goal of achieving 100% clean energy by the year 2050 at the latest. So I share this with you in part because I have a sense of urgency about steps like these, because we got to see specific action before it's too late. Congress should get focused on creating green collar jobs that both combat climate change and combat poverty at the same time. And that's more important than ever as we work to revitalize and re-energize the economy coming out of this pandemic. If we're smart about this, we can have a positive environmental impact. We can create jobs. We can also lower the transportation and electrical bills of the American people. Other nations have realized that investments on this front can benefit the economy. They can enable new industries, new jobs, and new opportunities. I'm proud that the state of Washington and our insurance commissioners recognize it. And it's time for the federal government to recognize that too. So these are some of the things I see as the most pressing issues that Congress will need to tackle in order to make real and lasting progress in our fight against climate change. I will also mention that there is some hope for bipartisanship on these issues. Maybe not with the current administration, but there is a bipartisan climate solutions caucus. I am a member of it. It's been nicknamed the Noah's Ark Caucus, not just because of the threat of biblical flooding, but because you can only join in pairs, one Democrat and one Republican. And we're trying to find where the two parties can come together to make the progress that's required to step up to this existential threat. So folks out there should know that, that certainly I will continue to play an active role in pushing for these actions to combat climate change. And I'm certainly committed to using the tools available to me as a member of Congress to protect our planet. I'm very grateful to have partners like Senator Rolfes and Commissioner Kreidler. We've got a lot of work to do to make sure we move forward and don't move backward in tackling this global challenge. And I'm grateful for their leadership. To Commissioner Kreidler, thank you for the invitation to participate today.
Thank you, Representative Kilmer. Please welcome back Commissioner Mike Kreidler, who has some questions for our panel.
Thank you very much to both of you, Congressman Kilmer and Senator Rolfes. Very much appreciate the enlightened leadership that you bring to the state of Washington and the issues that we are taking up in the state of Washington because of leaders like you. However, that as we look to the national scene and even in our own state environment, and I can relate to it somewhat because the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, where most commissioners are appointed by governors, you can imagine that many of them come from states that talking about climate is not advisable since they're Republican appointees and the Republican governor is not going to be encouraging that kind of discussion. So I have some empathy with it, but I really do have a question for you relative to your colleagues, whether it's at the nationally or at the state level, as to those that continue to deny climate change in the face of the unbelievable changes that we're already seeing as rapidly as they're taking place, and how they can continue to that kind of sentiment in this kind of environment. So, Senator Rolfes, I'll turn to you first and say why do we still have legislators that are still taking that approach, particularly here in the state of Washington with the wildfires that we've been experiencing just this year?
So certainly there are still climate deniers in the legislature. But I think they're fewer and further between than they were 10 years ago. What we still have a preponderance of are people who who maybe they acknowledge that the climate is changing, but they don't acknowledge that it's man's responsibility, that it's our responsibility to do anything about it. So where we have success with things like wildfire suppression or forest thinning, we're having that success not necessarily because they believe that there is climate change, but where it is clearly in the best interest of the area to fight, effectively protect the forests from catastrophic fires. So for where we're talking about resilience, we don't necessarily need to talk about why the change is happening, but we can get agreement that change is happening. When it comes to taking tougher votes, you'd like everybody to believe in the same science, but you play the hand you're dealt.
Oh, absolutely. Congressman, why are there so many deniers in the face of this, particularly from the southeast, where they're getting ready for another hurricane to make a strike someplace in that area?
Yeah, it's a real bummer. Honestly, I spent my first term in Congress on the Science Committee, and I started using quotation marks around the word science in the Science Committee when we had our third hearing on the myth of climate change. I think, unfortunately, and that's not hyperbole, that actually happened. I think we're in trouble when you've got leaders that are rejecting science and rejecting fact. Some of it, I will say, is tied to the significant role that the fossil fuel industry plays in some of those regions. To some degree, I think I've got colleagues who are responding to that either because of the outsized influence they play as a special interest, and sometimes as an outsized employer in some of those regions. And I think, to me, it underscores the importance of, as we transition away from being so reliant on fossil fuels, it's got to be a transition that doesn't leave people behind. We've got to be conscious of making sure that there's training and resources available, much as Senator Rolfes mentioned. As we looked at the coal-fired facility in our state, making sure that we're not saying to that community or to those workers, sorry, you're on your own, but rather having a transition plan that has their back. I think that's going to be an important part of this conversation going forward.
It's interesting. I listened to 60 Minutes last Sunday, and one of the scientists pointed out that to be a climate denier today is like denying denying gravity. It's just so far out of the mainstream of science that it's not even a realistic entity. So hopefully they start to make some progress in that regard. Another question would be if you have any suggestions how best to affect land use management to incorporate climate science into determining future use of land. Congressman, this is a tough issue, but let me turn to you first on that one.
Well, there's a couple pieces of this question that I'd want to unpack. One is how do we use land in a way that helps combat the climate crisis? So, for example, our public lands and the protection of our working forests. Our forests can serve as a carbon sink that can play an important role, and reforestation can certainly play an important role in combating the climate challenge. And so that is, to some degree, tied to how we look at land use management. And, certainly the administration's approach of wanting to, sell our public lands to the highest bidder, I think is concerning in that regard. On top of that, I think we need to think about it from a resiliency standpoint as well. And I would say that on two fronts. One, I've sponsored legislation that's called the Tribal Coastal Resiliency Act that acknowledges that we have Native American tribes, not just in our state, but around the country, that have to move to higher ground that are very resource constrained in their ability to do that. And so that needs to become a part of land planning, where we've got coastal communities, not just Native American tribes, but other coastal communities that may need to move either entire communities or at least assets where people might be in the line of fire to someplace else. And as a nation, we have not fully gotten our head around what that looks like. And certainly I and my team are working in that regard. The other piece of that, though, is also looking at things like the National Flood Insurance Program and whether we need to think about incentives so that in areas that are experiencing persistent flooding, maybe we rethink how we approach that so that we don't continue to run into the same problem over and over in areas that might be in the line of fire.
Good point. And it's certainly something I've been pushing with the insurance industry. I mean, if you want to, they can't walk away just because the water rises. That they should be advocating early as to land use practices, so that we don't so they're not encouraging by virtue of insuring initially, but then backing away from insuring that same property later on. They need to do it early. Senator, what do you say with the land use issues? How would you respond to that?
I would say, building on what the congressman was talking about, at the state level, we've already started to see where people living in wildfire hazard areas are having a tough time getting property insurance. And you can't blame the insurance companies, and yet you're leaving people behind who have always had insurance on their homes. So it then becomes incumbent upon county governments and local governments to help make sure that the building that's going on in that interface, that suburban urban interface with forest areas and wildfire hazard areas, is being built to code, being built to be fireproof, and being built in a way that the fire districts can defend it. Similarly, with new building on floodplains, you just can't allow it. The jurisdictions have to start looking at sea level rise and flooding and being more careful about where they're allowing new development to occur. And then when we're doing remodeling and things like that, people have to be thinking 20 years out. What's the climate going to be like in 20 years? What do I want to do with my home? What trees do I want to plant? What trees do I want to take down? I think local government as well as individuals need to just be looking further out to protect ourselves.
Very much appreciated. Yes. I should mention that our keynote speaker was Fawn Sharp, constituent of Congressman Kilmer, and very familiar with the problems of having to make plans to move the location of their tribal village by virtue of sea level rise and the threat that represents to them. And she did an outstanding job of being the keynote speaker for our summit, Climate Summit 2020. Much appreciated.
Commissioner Kreidler.
I was just going to ask, Stacy, is there anybody waiting to ask a question?
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions from our attendees, and they were directed towards Senator Rolfes, although feel free, Congressman Kilmer, to answer them as well. One of our attendees notes that customers in Seattle lack financial incentives to fuel switch from electric to gas, and asks what's being done to help and incentivize building managers to switch from gas to electric.
I don't know what they're doing in the city of Seattle specifically, but I do know that there is legislation being proposed to allow for fuel switching and to help with that transition. So hopefully the state will be in a position to help the city with some of the low-income customers that want to make that switch. But that is a question I'm not completely prepared to answer.
They are coming from our audience, so that's totally understood. We have one other question, which is related to transportation impacts. And the attendee would like to inquire about state strategies and incentives to get cars off the road in the first place, such as incentivizing businesses towards more telework policies.
Well, I'm not sure that we need to incentivize that at this point in time. I think that's happening organically, for better or worse. But the state does have what we call a commute trip reduction plan that incentivizes larger employers to promote carpooling and transit and people walking to work. So that is policy that the state has taken on over the years.
Wonderful. And Commissioner, if you have any additional questions, feel free to ask them. I believe we are running out of time.
Okay. Well, let me just express my deep appreciation to both you, Senator Rolfes and Congressman Kilmer. How much I appreciate it. There are lots of questions I'd like to ask, but we are approaching that challenge of time. But your presence here and participation has certainly helped to highlight the importance of this issue and made it a much more meaningful summit meeting on climate for us by virtue of your participation. So thank you very much. You're providing invaluable leadership. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Absolutely.